Hi, everyone. Welcome to Audubon's I Saw a Bird. My name is David Ringer, and I did see a few birds today, but I'm going to talk about one I heard, which was just before sunset, a white-throated sparrow calling in the brush, a kind of bell-like note that I always associate with fall and winter evenings. So we know the nights are getting shorter, but there's still so much light. How about you, Christine?
Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah, there's always cool birds that I hear at night. So I saw a scissor-tailed flycatcher when I was at the Trinity River Audubon Center not too long ago. So it was just flying overhead and I was like, that's the tail.
One of my favorites. Well,
Mhm.
Christine, who do you think is excited for our special Halloween episode tonight?
Well, David, I'll know that I am. And I think that it's especially fitting because it's also our 13th episode today.
Very true. Well, we have a great lineup for you this evening. We'll be learning all about how amazing owls are. We're going to be visiting with a rescue owl who now lives at the John James Audubon Center in Pennsylvania. We're also going to be talking with Bradford Casberg, who is the wetland restoration manager for Audubon Great Lakes. He'll be talking about a recent piece he wrote for Audubon about indigenous-led conservation. And then we'll jump back to more owls, and we'll visit with some guests from the Wild Bird Research Group and talk about what we can learn by banding owls. So we're really excited about tonight's lineup, and we hope you enjoy. So we'll end tonight, as we always do, with one thing you can do for birds. And it's very timely. We hope you'll hang in there and hear what it is.
Thank you, David. So, to kick things off, I'm super excited to bring on our next guest, who I've had the pleasure of working with personally in the past, and someone I know that our viewers are going to absolutely love. So, let's welcome to the show Carrie Barron, who is both the communications director of Audubon, Pennsylvania, and the center manager for the John James Audubon Center at Mill Grove, and her very special guest, Odin the Owl.
He's introducing himself right now. Thank you so much for having me. And again, my name is Carrie Barron, and I'm with our non-releasable great horned owl, Odin.
That's awesome. It's great to see you again, Odin, and great to see you again, Carrie. So, in your opinion, I want to know what's the spookiest, most amazing thing about owls? Can be one or the other or both.
Well, I think he's starting to show that to you right now. I think the spookiest thing is that many people think their heads can go around 360 degrees. And oftentimes, as you're looking at them, it almost appears that they do. But instead of going all the way around in a circle, which would make them lose their head, and that would be a very spooky Halloween, they can go 270 degrees, which is still extremely impressive. And they can do that because their eyes actually don't move within their socket, they stay fixed. So I would say the spookiest thing is their ability to do exactly that.
Amazing. Well, drop your questions in the chat for Carrie and Odin. But Carrie, as our folks are dropping in some questions for you, owls are such a unique form of raptors, right? They're hawks and eagles and kites, but owls really stand apart in that raptorial lifestyle. What are some of the things that make them so unique?
Well, just like you said, raptors are amazing across the board, and they have three things in common. So amazing eyesight, a hooked beak, and razor sharp talons. But great horned owls and other owls in general have two things that really set them apart. And so the first thing is you can see at the top of his head, he has tufts, and that's how he gets his name, great horned owl. But those are called ear tufts, but they're not actually his ears. Under all those feathers are actually ear slits, and on a great horned owl, they're about the size of a quarter. And what makes him an amazing hunter is they're actually asymmetrical. The one on the right is slightly higher than the one on the left. And this allows them to do something called triangulation, which is when they're up in a tree, they can hear something on the forest floor a split second in the lower ear before the upper ear. And so they move their head until the sound comes in at the same time. And that third point of the triangle is whatever they want for dinner. So I would say that's one reason. And the second is their silent flight. So no one even knows they're coming.
That's really cool. I think that's a good segue into one of our audience questions. Tip wants to know, how much does Odin weigh? So you said they can fly silently. So I wonder how does that play in?
Sure. So he actually looks larger than he weighs because birds' bones are hollow. So a mammal the same size would probably be twice the weight. This is a male great horned owl, so that's smaller than the females. So he's about 3.5 pounds and has almost a 4-foot wingspan. A female can go up to probably 4.5, 5 pounds and have a 5-foot wingspan. So they're significantly larger. Though holding one for a while does make them feel heavier than they actually are.
Yeah, I'm appreciating his hoots today. So there's another rehabilitated owl at the John James Audubon Center named Scooter. And I remember when we made a video with her, and she's an Eastern screech owl. And I couldn't believe how voraciously she ate a mouse. And we actually have a quick clip that we can share of her doing that.
I was
Yep, there she is.
did it.
And this is, I mean, this mouse, it's pretty small, but it's like a big portion of her body.
It absolutely is. So they only weigh a few grams. So I always liken it to the size of like a juice box. They're very, very small. And they can eat, as you're going to see in a minute, they can either, take off pieces or they can eat mice whole, and they eat about a mouse a night, an equivalent of whatever they're eating that evening. And so Scooter for us, even though typically nocturnal and when normally during the day, she did that for us, which is perfectly appropriate as we move into spooky Halloween.
Very fitting.
Indeed. Well, speaking of food, Carrie, one of our viewers named Pamela wants to know what would be the favorite food of a great horned owl?
Well, they're not very picky in the fact that they'll eat anything that they can kind of get their talons on. But, they have a wide variety of foods, which really is beneficial to them. So if it's alive and they can catch it, they'll eat it. They also can carry 2 times their body weight. So at, 3.5 pounds, that's something 7 pounds. So that's a large groundhog. But something they eat that many other animals don't eat is skunks. And that's because they have a very terrible sense of smell. So it doesn't matter to them what comes out as long as they can still eat it. So unlike many animals, skunks is one of great horned owl's favorite foods. But they eat a very wide variety of foods, and including birds.
Wow, I did not know that they could eat skunks, but learned something new today. So we just showed a clip of Scooter, and from my understanding, she ended up at John James Audubon because she was hit by a car. So I'm wondering, are cars a big concern for owls in general, and why is that?
Yeah, so you think about when you're driving down the road, I'm constantly looking for birds. I guess it's part of the job. But if you're driving down the road and you're kind of keeping your eye out, oftentimes you see hawks on the sides of roads using light towers or power poles. And those same perches are used by owls at night. But unlike the daytime or diurnal birds, they can see the cars and we can see them. The same thing's happening in the evening, but our vision is down. And even though they have amazing night vision, it's hard for them to judge the car coming at a certain speed. And so there's a lot of rodents that use roadsides as places for them to find food and scurry. And so when owls come out to grab that prey, they oftentimes they can't gauge the car. And so car hits are a very, very common thing to happen to owls.
Well, and that's certainly hard, but we're glad you're there to help rescue the ones who make it, Carrie. Some of the other owls, though, are there because they imprinted on humans. People didn't treat them properly. Can you talk a little bit about why proper behavior around wild birds is so important?
Absolutely. Well, you might wonder why Odin is so vocal, and especially day and at night and around us, because he was imprinted. And so imprinting means that unlike hatching and becoming a fledgling and learning how to be a wild bird by their parents, Odin was taken out of his nest when he was a baby owl called an owlet. And he was raised to try to be a falconry bird. Owls do not make the best falconry birds, especially this specific owl. I always say he got fired, meaning he just was not appropriate for falconry. And at that point, though, he had never learned how to hunt, by watching his parents. He didn't know how to find his own food. He didn't know, honestly, there was no kind of wild instincts. And that's the same thing that's true with our blue jay. Our blue jay Conrad was taken out of his nest when he was a baby, raised, and doesn't know how to be a wild bird and can't even defend himself. So imprinting is when that happens. And that's why if you ever find a baby bird, the best thing to do is leave it there or call the wildlife rescue, because a parent bird is the best thing to ever raise a baby bird. We do have amazing animal ambassadors, but we wish they would stay in the wild.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think that's really important to keep in mind. And in honor of Odin today, I'm wearing a great horned owl shirt, I believe. It's a John James Audubon shirt. So if you want to purchase it, we have a link to buy these shirts on Audubon as well. And I see David's also wearing a Audubon owl shirt. So we have another viewer question from Stacy, who wants to know, are all owls nocturnal?
That's a great question. They're not all purely nocturnal. If you are purely nocturnal, I'm obviously diurnal because I'm not good at night. If you're purely nocturnal, you would literally be up all night and then during the day fully asleep. Owls, depending on the species, some of them are awake during the day. And the first time I saw a great horned owl was down in Florida, and it was in the tree in the middle of the day, wide awake. They're opportunists. And so if a great horned owl is hungry and hears something that could be food and it's the middle of the day, he will go and catch that prey. So that is typical of owls, that they're nocturnal, but that doesn't mean that they won't hunt during the day. So that's basically it. David, is there anything else you wanted to add about nocturnal versus diurnal birds?
Well, the owls that are looming over both Christine and my shoulder, the snowy owl and the burrowing owl, are mostly diurnal. So they're pretty unusual. They do almost all of their activity during the day, which is one of the reasons people get such great pictures of them.
And also why they're so still right now, because it's, nighttime.
Exactly.
True.
They'd make good Zoom buddies during the day as well.
Oh dear. Well, Carrie, one of our viewers named Mary would like to know, and we're seeing Odin do this, why owls bob their heads.
Oh, interesting. So, well, it depends on what exactly he's trying to do. So one thing is, while he's looking around, it helps him kind of put things in view. So his eyes, and I wanted to tell you, this is really cool. His eyes are actually 3% of his body weight. So if we had eyes the size of an owl's, they would basically be softballs, and have extra rods in their eyes, which allows them to see better at night. But also you'll see constantly, not only are they bobbing their head, they're also kind of adjusting, and their pupils will go in and out. This just all helps with intake of what they're looking at. They have binocular vision, which more so than most birds, which allows them to see out of both eyes. That's all that really means. But their eyesight is very, very important at night, because without that, they wouldn't be good predators. And so when he's bobbing his head, he's really just kind of readjusting his eyesight and looking around. I'm at a museum right now, so he's very interested in our exhibits, and that's what he's kind of looking at behind me.
He's like, who are all these birds around me who are not moving? So we're getting a lot of questions from multiple viewers. Why do owls hoot, as demonstrated by Odin right now?
Well, it's a form of communication. And so just as I'm speaking to you right now, owls can communicate through hooting. One time you'll hear it, well, it could be to defend its territory. He's just vocal because, as I said, he's imprinted. And so he was constantly communicating with the person that was raising him. Another reason you might hear them hooting is for breeding. And owls are really interesting because they have very, very, and actually great horned owls have early breeding seasons. So late winter, depending on where you are, even December, January, February, they're actually breeding, and their babies are born early spring, which makes them able to hunt much more successfully on all the other birds and mammals that are being born at that time. Another really cool adaptation that they have.
Amazing. Well, Karen is wondering whether male owls and female owls have different vocalizations or whether they sound the same.
Well, this one has been filling my ear a lot. I know at least, and David, you can kind of pitch in here as well, but we've had a breeding pair of great horned owls on our site for the past about 3 years. And one of the very interesting things is that we know they're there from 2 reasons. One is we start to hear this kind of mating call back and forth. Also, we find a ton of pellets at the bottom of our pine tree. That's our usual telltale tale. But David, did you want to talk a little bit more about the vocalization between male and females?
You know, pairs of owls will call back and forth together, and they'll often, depending on the species, sound pretty similar. But one of the really cool things about the great horned owl, like Odin, is that the male and female owls actually have different pitches to their voices. So you'll hear them calling back and forth in the winter, like you just described, Carrie, and you'll hear a bird like Odin, and then you'll hear a bird with a slightly different pitch. And you know that that's the mate because one's a little higher, one's a little lower. Other owls like barred owls, I'm not aware of a particular distinction, but they're very vocal back and forth as pairs, calling a lot together.
I think that's a good follow-up question from Diane, who asks, do owls mate for life?
They do. They're monogamous. And in fact, we haven't been able to band our owls, but in banding studies in the past, and you might learn a little bit more about that later tonight, they do see that they're monogamous. And so, and ours have returned to the same sycamore year after year. One interesting thing about great horned owls is they don't make their own nest. They typically use nests of another bird, maybe a red-tailed hawk. And since they're nesting at a different time, they're able to do that. And they usually use a cavity. So they're a little harder to find. You're not normally going to see, you know, a nest sitting on a tree. They're kind of hidden in. But again, listening and looking for evidence like pellets is always a cool way to try and look in late winter to see if you have a nesting pair.
So many great questions coming in. Keep them coming. Barb is wondering whether some owls migrate.
Well, that's really interesting. Some owls do migrate. The great horned owls typically don't need to. They have such an abundance of food where they live, and they can live in so many habitats. So unlike some birds, they have very specific habitat and very specific food needs because they can live in forests and wetlands and suburbs and just about anywhere, and they can eat anything that's alive. So anything from a small little, rodent to, as I said, a skunk or other birds. They have such a wide range of habitats and food, so they do not have to. There's other owls like the snowy owl behind David that it's not necessarily a migration, but based on food needs, they may need to move based on season to season. So it's really dependent on species, and even like a snowy owl, they may go down south one year, but not the other. And that's actually really interesting thing to look up. It's Project the Snowy Owl Project. If you ever go online, it's very cool. I'm sure it can be in the chat below.
Yeah, we can drop that in. And it's amazing. I mean, they put satellite transmitters on some of these snowy owls and track them over hundreds and even thousands of miles on these journeys. Really extraordinary. So another good question from Kurt, who wants to know what are some of the largest species of owls? And then a follow-up from Grace, who wants to know about some of the smallest species.
So in Pennsylvania, or kind of in this area, so where you have people from across the United States and maybe further away than that, but this is our largest in Pennsylvania. This is our largest owl. We do have barred owls, and we do have, this actually is probably barred, and sometimes we have snowies that come rarely to visit. I think the largest owl in the world is the Eurasian eagle owl. David, is that correct?
That's right. Yep.
I have never seen one myself, but I do watch a lot of nature shows. So I think it's the largest owl. In the United States, I would assume it is the great horned owl. Is that correct, David? Or
well, to your point earlier, Carrie, the birds can look bigger than they are. And so I think our longest owl in terms of its measurements is the great gray owl, which is a bird of the pine forest, but it's not the largest by body mass. So the snowy owl would probably claim that victory most of the time, but some of the great horns can rival that as well.
especially the females.
Yes,
They
yeah.
can be quite large. And small owls, so we were talking about Scooter earlier. Eastern screech owls are very small. Saw-whet owls, which you will see later, they're very small. And burrowing owls, there are a lot of smaller owls, alpha owls as well. So it's very interesting. A lot of kids see my screech owls and think that they are babies. They are full grown. They are just, that's just how their species is. So that, I'm not the smallest, maybe a saw-whet, but so, you know, those are smaller owls that are a couple of grams.
And the elf owl that you mentioned is a southwestern resident. They eat mostly insects. They're so small they can fit in the palm of your hand, and they nest in woodpecker holes in trees and cacti.
That's
Well, Carrie, this is a good point. So we've a couple of times been talking about owl pellets, but some of our viewers are saying, what in the world is an owl pellet? What do you mean by that?
Well, owl pellets are really cool if you like kind of gross stuff and science, which I do. So owl pellets are what comes out of owls' mouths 6 to 8 hours typically after they eat. So when they eat something, they can't digest anything that's not kind of the meat. So anything, bones, fur, feathers, you know, scales, if it happens to be a snake, those things can't be digested. And so they get coughed up in what is an owl pellet. It looks almost like something that you might find in your dryer, or if you have a cat, you know, a cat ball. But inside of it are the bones and the feathers or whatever it ate. So it's really interesting because scientists use that to look at the biodiversity of an area. So if you know where owl pellets are, you can collect them and you can figure out sort of how, you know, what is the proportion of small mammals versus, you know, birds, et cetera. We only get mice pellets because that's all we feed our owls. But we have a regular supply, which is great when we're dissecting them and showing kids. So that's what an owl pellet is. And if you ever have seen an owl that's eaten a cardinal, you will definitely wonder what that is on the ground, because that's a pretty cool pellet.
Oh, wow.
I've seen one.
Yeah, one of my earliest and coolest memories of science class in school was, you know, dissecting an owl pellet, and I've been hooked on owls since then. So James is curious if owls will attack other birds of prey, like hawks, for example.
They will. Great horned owls are known to attack other raptors. Typically, diurnal birds won't, you know, and nocturnal birds won't be out at the same time. But great horned owls are known to eat smaller owls. So that definitely happens, especially if they're very hungry, and that happens to be the easiest thing. As I said, they're opportunists. They're going to go after the first food that they kind of set their eyes on. So yes, great horned owls and other raptors will eat other birds of prey.
And we just had someone in the chat mention something that some of our viewers may be familiar with. So the osprey cam at Hog Island, great horned owls have preyed on that nest, or attempted to, more than once. Backing up what you're saying there, Carrie. We can probably drop a link into some of that footage at some point this evening. So Carrie, final question for you and Odin. It's been so great having you. What can people do to help protect owls and their habitat in the wild?
Well, as I said, you know, a lot of them are cavity nesters. And one thing that is happening is a lot of times old and dead trees, instead of being left, are taken down. And so they have limited habitat. So right now would be a great time to put up an owl box. And we have screech owl boxes here. You need to make sure they go up before breeding season. But that provides, just like any bird house, a place for them to nest. And not only is it wonderful for the birds, it's great for you, because what a great opportunity is to see owlets fledge. The other thing I would say is it's fall and perfect time to plant native plants. Even though they do not eat native plants, they eat the things that do. And we have a wonderful database that you can go in, plug in, and find what really grows well in your area. So I would say of the top 2 things, that would be them.
That's great. Well, thank you so much to you and to Odin for joining us tonight. We really appreciate everything you do. And several of our viewers have said this is their favorite I Saw a Bird segment in all 13 episodes so far.
Well, thank you. I will say Odin probably has to take the credit, but I really appreciate it. Thank you all for having us, and happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
Yes. Thank you both. So we are excited to welcome on our next guest, Bradford Kasberg, who joined Audubon Great Lakes in 2018 as the Wetland Restoration Manager. And Bradford is a citizen of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma, and he's an alum of the Masters of Landscape Architecture program at the University of Michigan. And earlier in October, Bradford actually wrote a piece for Audubon that talked about how Indigenous Peoples Day is a chance to both celebrate the diversity and resilience of our country's original inhabitants, whose long overlooked, ecological knowledge can help and lead conservation today. So welcome to the show, Bradford.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I also have to point out, I just noticed I'm wearing the exact same shirt as I am in the photograph for the article you just shared. So I'm consistent here in my messaging.
Yeah, you're on brand.
COVID is challenging all of our wardrobes, isn't it? So Bradford, it's great to have you on, and we appreciate all you do. In the article that we just referenced, and the link will be in the chat for folks who want to see it themselves, you talk about how your ancestors and your homeland both influence how you approach your work in wetlands restoration. Tell our viewers a little bit more about what that means for you.
Absolutely. First, let me just formally introduce myself. Kinja Salta Wayne Swane, Nila Miamia Mitosenia, Tepewe Nialaka Kokecheke, Nungi Pekondeche. My name is Brad Kasberg. I'm a citizen of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. Our homelands include Chicago, where I live and work today, and extended mostly throughout the state of Illinois and Indiana, across the Illinois and Wabash River Valley. So a lot of the wetlands that we work on at Audubon Great Lakes are areas that my ancestors have always called home. And it's very important for us to recognize that, and I've been able to carry that with me in a few different ways. First of all, a very important piece of most indigenous communities, I won't speak for all, but for my community and for others like it, the idea that birds, and for that matter, other wildlife, other plants and animals, are considered relatives. They are entities which we can learn from and which we can share with, and we benefit from, and our actions also benefit them. So taking that perspective into the workplace has been really important, just because there's so much disturbance in these natural areas that many people want to preserve them and leave them aside and let just nature take its course. But the most important thing that my community and that I want to do and carry forward is make sure that the human element is always there. We are not necessarily a guiding hand, but a one hand of influence among many.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And thank you, Bradford, for your intro. You've also talked about the need for Indigenous outreach when planning for conservation. Could you give us an example of this type of work?
Absolutely. So early on in my tenure here at Audubon Great Lakes, we developed something called the Great Lakes Coastal Wetland Spatial Prioritization, which means we looked at wetlands all across the Great Lakes and looked at different factors, whether that was suitability of a myriad of marsh birds or negative influencers like excess nitrogen or phosphorus or anything like that, to really get a sense of what coastal wetlands are critical to protect, which ones do we really need to intervene in their health in order to maximize the benefit for threatened and endangered marsh birds and birds as a whole. But I had one other thought when looking at that and saying, we have this extensive network of coastal wetlands. What does that mean in relation to the tribal entities that exist throughout the Great Lakes? How do those communities overlap with what we're identifying as wetland priorities? And so I was able to do that, and that has guided our outreach into several different communities. And that's important not just for the sake of prioritizing wetlands, but it's an important element of our work because when we talk about environmental justice and conservation, we really want to emphasize the fact that we're reaching out to all people and all communities. It's not just us in Chicago doing conservation. It's these tribes up in, for example, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, who are stellar conservationists and monitoring a whole range of birds that other state agencies or other local environmental orgs may not necessarily be concerned about, just because these particular birds are of cultural or social importance. So there's an extra eye on their stewardship there. So I would like to point out in this map here in Sault Ste. Marie, you can see even from this satellite view of that stretch of the eastern Upper Peninsula, just how many coastal wetlands there are. And so we've been really lucky to be able to work with the Sault Ste. Marie band of Chippewa to facilitate some of this conservation for birds like black terns.
That's really terrific. Bradford, another part of the restoration that you've done over time is working with native plants, and we'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. So again, stemming back to the idea that we are all relatives, our plant and animal relatives, it's really important for us here to maintain that balance. There's a sense in many of our calendars or our cyclical systems of approaching, harvesting and hunting, that there's stewardship in there. And now, because we have had such a heavy amount of disturbance and for wetlands, we've had many wetlands drained, and prairies, they've been cut up and turned into agricultural plots. There's that cycle has been broken a bit. And so my work is really focused on, in the face of climate change and in the face of invasive encroachment, trying to restore those native plants, not just for the sake of, the biodiversity of the region or a high C value if you're an ecologist, but to make sure that we can provide as many resources for our bird relatives and our other relatives in the wild.
That's really beautiful. And you've touched on the role that birds and wildlife play in your community and in the ecological communities of your homeland. Could I ask you what role birds play in your life personally?
Absolutely. They are an indelible part of my identity, to be honest. The sandhill crane is one of our it's a bird we use to represent our community. So it's always heartwarming to see them return or fly over. There's an extra element of who I am with those birds. But then, day to day, it's a treat to see the sandhill cranes. They're not by me all the time. But to be with the everyday birds that are around you and to experience their subtle changes through the year, to experience how they're reacting to the environment around them, whether, that's because of something I did with my wetland work or just, walking the dog and seeing, just that someone didn't rake their leaves, and that's wonderful. You really just get a sense of your belonging and your place in the world, and recognizing that these birds are as much an active agent in the landscape as we are. I'll just say that I saw a kinglet just perusing someone's yard yesterday morning, and it was kind enough to expose the the crown to show me that it was a ruby crowned kinglet. And in indigenous culture, a lot of times you phrase it as animals revealing themselves to you, not so much you seeking and hunting them out. And that's true for even like hunting for food. It was really nice just to walk by with the dog and appreciate and thank my bird relative for providing that little bit of wonder in the day.
And revealing itself in that moment. Well, one of our viewers, Esteban, wants to say thank you for your work, Mr. Kasberg. I wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah, I
Thank
second that. So that's a really beautiful way, by the way, to put it, how, birds and animals are revealing themselves to us rather than the other way around. And I wanted to mention that research has shown that Indigenous people, while they make up less than 5% of the world's population, their lands and work also help support 80% of our planet's biodiversity. So could you talk about some of the ways that the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma helps keep habitats healthy and sustainable?
Absolutely. So my tribe, I will say we were forcefully removed from our homelands, and as such, we have had a significant loss of lands. So there's a difficult history there of survival, but we are now at a point where we are really becoming active stewards again. And one really exciting element that happened about 5 years ago or so, we discovered purple milkweed. We're in the northeastern corner of Oklahoma, and that's a particularly beautiful milkweed. It's on the rarer side, at least in that stretch of the state. And through that work and through some communication with some other tribes, we established a monarch conservation agreement across several tribes in northeast Oklahoma to facilitate prairie plants and the birds that migrate through them.
Wow, that's awesome to hear. And it's super inspiring to hear the work that you're doing as well. So thank you so much for joining us today, Bradford. Again, we'll drop a link to the article that you recently published on Audubon, as well as a link to some of the projects that you talked about today, so our viewers can learn more.
All right.
Thanks so
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, next up, we're excited to bring on two more special guests. Tyler Christensen is a licensed bird bander, and he's the director of the nonprofit Wild Bird Research Group. He conducts research on owls, hummingbirds, and songbirds from New Jersey to Costa Rica. And he's joined by Sean Grazer, who's a creative director for the Wild Bird Research Group. He's a conservation photographer, a storyteller, and a biologist. And if you regularly see audubon.org, you may be familiar with some of Sean's work. So welcome to the show, both of you.
Thank you. It's good to be here, I guess.
Well, we know that you're hard at work. You're researching birds tonight, and you're doing some banding work. So what's going on there tonight where you are?
Well, so tonight we are netting and banding northern saw-whet owls during their southbound migrations. So we've been at it for about an hour and a half ever since sunset. So on nights where we do this research, we're setting up nets around sunset, catching owls for about 6 hours. And we actually just brought in a northern saw-whet from one of our net checks.
Oh, wow. So beautiful and tiny.
Yeah, they're really
amazing. So obviously you're catching these owls responsibly. Could you tell our viewers how exactly you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we use specialized nets called mist nets. And these are designed to safely catch wild birds. Of course, it's important to know that you need to be trained and licensed in order to do this. Like these mist nets are very commonly used in field ornithology. As I mentioned, we open these nets at sunset. They remain open for 6 hours before we take them down. And while they're open, we check the nets frequently because we don't want the owls to wait around too long. They have very busy schedules, lots to do. So we want them to be able to get back to what it is that they're doing very quickly with minimal disruption to their daily lives.
Right. And I think Sean is going to be pulling the process up for us. But Can you tell us a little bit about how you measure the owls here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Hopefully folks are seeing that now.
Absolutely. So Sean is going to take the standard set of measurements that we normally take, and I'm going to talk you through the process. So he's just across the desk from me. We have a webcam facing down on what Sean's doing. So right now, he just measured the wing chord. That's the length of the wing, but accounting for the natural curvature of the wing. So that wing length is a really important measurement, and I'll explain why in just a minute. Right now, he's measuring the tail. Okay.
Could you remind our viewers what species this owl is for those who don't know?
Absolutely. This is the northern saw-whet owl, Aegolius acaticus, and it is the smallest owl in eastern North America, and I would argue the cutest owl in eastern North America, although Odin definitely gives the saw-whet a run for its money.
Yes.
Sean's going to give me the band number on this owl. So this owl was actually already banded. I know I haven't really talked much about the banding process yet, but this
wow.
bird is already wearing a band on its leg. So you're a little farther away from the camera, Sean. There it is. That's in focus. So you can see the band on that bird's leg. And that band has a unique serial number on it, which Sean is going to read me right now. 1124 025 40. Okay, great. So this is a bird, just from the sequence we know that, oh, here's Sean getting footed. So from the band sequence, we know that this is a bird that we banded. Okay, that's part of our band series. So now we'll get back to that in a second. Right now, Sean's going to dim the lights, and he's going to show you how we determine the ages of these saw-whet owls. Okay. I'm going to open the wing of this bird and shine UV light on the wing. There we go.
Oh, wow.
It's fascinating.
So from this pattern, what we're seeing is a fluorescence pattern of a hatchier bird. I'll explain how we know that in just a second. Hang on just a second, Sean, because I need to fill them in on the porphyrin situation. So saw-whet owls, and indeed many owls, they have pigments in their feathers called porphyrins. And porphyrins are a very common class of pigments in nature. But a really neat attribute of porphyrins is that they fluoresce when they're under UV light, or at least the porphyrins that are in owl plumages. And so the fluorescent quality of those feathers fades as the feathers age. Okay, so with exposure to sunlight, the fluorescence fades. And so because owls have age-specific patterns of feather replacement, the UV patterns make it really easy to tell what those patterns are. So it's very easy to infer the ages of the owls based on the UV pattern in the wing. Okay, and so on this owl, all of those feathers were consistently pink, meaning that they grew at the same time. The only time in the owl's life where that would have happened is when it was in the nest, growing all of its flight feathers at the same time.
That's really amazing. And Tyler, a lot of birds can actually see in the ultraviolet spectrum, which we humans can't. So does that mean birds look different to each other than they look to us?
That's a really good question. And indeed, that's definitely true of many birds. As far as owls, though, it seems like owls may not have the photoreceptor responsible for vision in the UV part of the spectrum. So it could be that they don't actually see these patterns, which would be a pretty fascinating thing. It could also be that we just don't understand what's going on underneath the surface here. There might be something that we just don't know yet.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you've got the owl banded already. You read off the number. Tell us a little bit about the banding purpose and what those numbers represent, how you use those.
Sure, absolutely. 91? 91 grams. Okay, sorry, I just needed to get a weight on this owl.
Of course.
Yeah, so the bands each have a unique serial number that's unique to that individual owl. So a common analogy that I like to use, and that many other people like to use, is that it's akin to the bird's social security number, right? So that lightweight aluminum band, which doesn't harm the bird in any way, the bird wears that for the rest of its life. Okay, so any subsequent encounters with that bird, you can associate with all the data that's ever been reported on that bird. Okay, so if somebody else was to recapture this owl at a different banding station, or if something like tonight just happened where we recapture one of our own banded owls, we can sort of connect the dots between these successive encounters and in that way piece together the life histories of these birds. And that's how we've learned what we know about saw-whet owl migration and much about their ecology. And that's true of many, many species of birds.
Yeah, that's really cool. So what else can we learn? You touched a little bit about on this already, but what else can we learn from banding birds, such as these owls?
You wanna-
Yeah. So, for example, banding birds can tell us a lot about migration, dispersal, behavior, social structure, survival rates, longevity, reproduction, and population patterns. So the slide you're seeing right now is actually northern saw-whet owls that have come through our station that have been actually first caught at one of these other stations. So as you can see, we get birds from Ontario, we get birds from Maine, from Vermont. So we're learning all about their migration patterns due to these types of data points that we're getting. Just the other night, we had a brand new owl that came through that had been processed at a different station, most likely in Canada or Maine.
That's amazing.
End of this year, and so that data isn't in the database yet. But once it is, we'll find out when and where it was first banded.
Very cool. Well, I want to ask you about banding hummingbirds in a minute, but first the question several of our viewers are asking, which is whether this process is stressful for the owls.
It's difficult to say with complete certainty, but you saw that the owl was very calm throughout this whole process. That's true of most of the owls that we handle. Saw-whet owls seem very, very calm through the handling and banding process. We would be dealing with this situation very differently if we were dealing with songbirds, which are much more stress prone, much smaller, delicate, faster metabolisms, and much more prone to stress. So owls just seem much, much more calm throughout this whole process.
Mm-hmm. Well, and certainly it moves very quickly. So as I said, I want to ask about hummingbirds. You've banded hummingbirds as well. What is that like? They're so small, I can't imagine.
Yeah, it's actually a very different process to actually be able to do the data and to like figure out what we need to do. We actually use jeweler's glasses. We wear them to be able to see everything we're doing. Now, to actually band and process hummingbirds, you actually have to have another license different from the normal federal license. So you have to be certified to be able to do hummingbirds because it is such delicate work. Now, we've been doing hummingbird data for a long time. We have a project in Costa Rica where we kind of study the competition patterns of local population hummingbirds versus the eastern migrant ruby-throated hummingbird. And our station actually was the first to prove that the ruby-throated hummingbird comes back to the same area year after year. We've now caught multiple recaptured hummingbirds over the course of 10 years.
And this is on the wintering ground, so they come back to the same place in the winter.
Correct. Yeah, right there you're seeing, that's actually a large hummingbird band. And that's that's a little bit larger than a quarter. That's the Costa Rican like quarter equivalent. And you can see how small that band is. It doesn't even like fit onto the letter of the coin there. So we're dealing with minuscule type bands here.
Incredible.
Yeah, that's tiny. So obviously this takes a lot of skill. What process do you go through to become a certified bander? And as a follow-up, what's your favorite bird to band if you have one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the process is pretty complicated. So because birds are federally protected, you need to become trained and certified. But they have very high standards for bird banders, basically. So the standards have to do with your experience banding birds and with your qualifications. They also have to do with the study at hand. So you need to have a very, very good reason to band birds. And in addition, you need to have a lot of background training. And for us, that took the form of what basically amounted to a mentorship and an apprenticeship. We trained for many years with a master bird bander before we had the qualifications to apply for our own federal and state banding permits. As far as what our favorite bird to band is, I think I'm gonna stick with the owls. I really like the saw-whet owls.
I'm gonna go with the tongue-in-cheek answer of the best bird is the bird in your hand.
That's great. Well, we have a question from one of our viewers named Sharon, and Sharon is wondering where exactly you are tonight and also whether you're part of the Motus network, which you might explain for some of our viewers.
Sure. So we are at the Mercer County Park Commission headquarters in Pennington, New Jersey. So we're at the historic Hunt House. You can tell that we're in a barn, perhaps. And so we've been partnered up with Mercer County Park Commission for a number of years now doing this research here at Mercer Meadows. And I'm sorry, what was the follow-up question?
Whether you're part of MODIS and what that is for those who don't know.
Sure. So the MODIS system and the MODIS network is a really fascinating and growing network of receiving stations that are used to track bird migrations. And so you can put really tiny transmitters, very, very lightweight nanotags on birds that are migrating. And if they pass within a certain distance of a receiving station, you get a ping, okay? And so if you have enough of a network of these MODIS receiving stations, you can, with a much greater degree of accuracy and frequency, get pings from birds as they migrate south or north, or as they, maybe disperse after the breeding season. And so in areas that have a really well-developed MODIS network, we're learning a tremendous amount about the biologies and movements and dispersal of wild birds. And that is starting to, it's a growing technology. And so the more it develops, the more we'll be able to use it to track migrations of birds like saw-whet owls.
Fascinating. So through your nonprofit, which is, we mentioned, is the Wild Bird Research Organization, you work from New Jersey to Costa Rica, and you've talked about both ends of that spectrum tonight. Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of full life cycle conservation for birds?
Yeah, of course. One of the greatest known areas for birds is like their breeding grounds in North America. And we're doing a lot, and Audubon is doing a lot to do, understand these, figure out what birds need. But unfortunately, they spend the other 8 months in Central and South America. And that's like a big gap in a lot of knowledge because we're, unsure of, some of the habitat preferences they have, what they're doing down there, what they're eating down there. So we kind of started Wild Bird to figure some of that out. So we've been doing work in Costa Rica now for about a decade. And it's really, really some of the most important work because, the deforestation and climate change is hitting that area much quicker than it is up here. So that was why we kind of started this project in Costa Rica. And then now it's evolved into a greater thing.
Yeah, it's great. And you can do a lot of really great things conserving your local bird communities. But, the birds don't exist in the bubbles that we do. They're traveling between bubbles, so to speak. And so it's really important that the conservation is an international effort.
Yeah, I think we can develop a pretty myopic view and think of these as our birds when actually they spend most of their lives away from North America. Well, a couple of viewers, Tyler, are asking, what is on your head?
Oh, this is a headlamp. So, out here working at night in the dark, it's really important to work hands-free. And so all of us have headlamps that we wear for most of the night. Guess I don't need to be wearing it indoors though, do I?
Well, it made you look very official.
Yeah, it's very handy. So I'm wondering, how many owls on average do you band a night?
That's a really fabulous question. Do you mind if I jump in? All right. Really fabulous question. It is incredibly variable. And it varies from night to night, and it also varies from year to year. And lots and lots of factors go into it. From year to year, the thing that it's most directly tied to is how productive of a breeding season they had up north. And so much like the finches and red-breasted nuthatches and things like that, saw-whet owls are eruptive migrants. And so when there are a lot of young saw-whet owls produced during a really great breeding season, they're forced to disperse more widely to find winter habitats to sustain them. And so in those years, we get lots and lots of owls. And then right now, we're approaching peak migration within the season. And tonight's a decent night. We have west-northwest winds, which isn't great. North winds are best because the owls like to migrate with a tailwind. The ideal night for catching owls is probably clear with north winds and quite cold. And on a night like that, in a peak year, we may catch as many as 60 owls in a night. On a really bad night, even during peak migration, in a lousy year, we could catch no owls. So it's very, very hit or miss. So I want to stress, you're very, very lucky that we caught a saw-whet owl during this program.
It's really exciting. We're so glad. Just a quick follow-up question on the saw-whets in particular. So as we all saw, it's a very small owl, strictly nocturnal. And I think through banding efforts like yours, we've learned a lot in the last decade or so about how widespread these birds actually are.
Yeah, absolutely. So these used to be thought of as a rare owl. And even as recently as the mid-1900s, it was thought that around New Jersey or Pennsylvania was the southern terminus of their winter range. But now that we're studying saw-whets much more carefully and the network of saw-whet owl banders is growing, we now know them to be among the most abundant owls in North America. And in lots of places, including New Jersey, it's probably the most abundant owl during migration. And we also know that it's not unusual for them to reach the Gulf Coast in winters when a lot of owls are migrating, so during big flight years.
It's just amazing. And most people never even see them, even birders.
Yeah, it really is incredible. And it's fantastic because it took me many years of owling before I saw my first wild saw-whet owl. So it still floors me that we can catch, 50, 60 owls in a single night.
That's breathtaking. Well, thank you both so much. We know you're busy. We know you're taking good care of the birds, but we appreciate you joining us. Our viewers have just loved learning more and seeing what you're up to. Thanks for sharing your knowledge and expertise. And Sean, also for all your beautiful photos. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, guys.
Good luck with the owls.
Thanks very much.
And thank you to the owl, who was a very good sport. And as we do each episode, we're going to end with one thing you can do to help birds this month. And because Election Day is only 6 days away, there's one thing you can do for birds right now, which is to vote. So in addition to the presidential race, there are countless state and local elections happening nationwide this year that will also have a big impact on our communities and our birds. And these decision makers have an important influence on the ways that laws are written and enacted at every level of government. And something we like to say often at Audubon is, birds can't vote, but you can. And while Election Day is an important day, many states have early voting. And I actually am one of the 800,000 voters under the age of 30 who have already voted in my home state of Texas. I went in earlier this week to cast my ballot. So I wanted to encourage you all to join me today to vote, either early or on Election Day. And we've pulled together a list of resources at audubon.org/vote-info that will help you find where your polling location is, as well as a resource to triple your vote, so to speak, and get 3 friends to vote for the birds this fall. And because I consider all of you viewers on I Saw a Bird my friends, I'm more than tripling my vote today when I ask you to join me in voting. So, David, as you often like to say, you are my favorite co-host. And with that, we will say goodbye and see you next month.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.